Welcome to the only daily podcast focusing on compliance news of the day. Each morning, start your day with a cup of coffee and Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, to hear about 4 of the top compliance, corruption, or leadership stories you will need to start your day. The Daily Compliance News is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
First, a word from our sponsor. The Daily Compliance News for December 7, 2022, the Chief Critical Officer Edition. And we begin with that story from Bloomberg, who asked that in the wake of Enron and nearly 20 years later, or over 20 years later, FTX, does corporate governance need a Chief Critical Officer who will cut through the charisma and bubble that many chief executives find themselves and provide guidance with critique of a CEO's job performance with brutal honesty? Clearly, corporate governance was a disaster at Enron, and it was a disaster at FTX, and it was a disaster with everyone who invested money in FTX without doing the bare minimum of due diligence. So do you need a chief critical officer going forward? Next up, in a story that will no doubt warm the hearts of magma hat-wearing GOP folks everywhere, the Indonesian parliament has approved a new criminal code which bans sex outside marriage. I can't wait to see what the U.S. Supreme Court would do with a law such as this. Next up, from the New York Times, it turns out that the global car supply chain is entangled with abuses in Xingjian province. The global auto industry is heavily exposed to Xingjian for raw materials, and despite the U.S. law, which targets the human rights abuses against Muslims there, U.S. companies are using metals for battery supplies, wiring, and wheels. This could be really devastating to automobile supply chains, and if you're in this industry and you're listening, you better start checking to see if you're getting any supplies out of that region, because remember, the burden of proof is on you, and the presumption is that the goods or products you are buying were made with slave labor. So check it all out. And our final story comes to us from the FT, which has a really interesting article which asks, is the German business model broken? And they ask that question in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because it turns out the German business model is based upon cheap energy from Russia. That is no longer available after that invasion. And certainly I have been advocating and talking about how business has changed forever after the Russian invasion, but the German business model may have changed forever as well, as Germany now has to switch over to more expensive OPEC energy, and the cost will only increase going forward, so supply chains still an issue. The Daily Compliance News is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and a proud member of C-Suite Radio. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you'll join me again tomorrow.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.